Hello everyone and welcome to Audit Trails. Today we'll be talking about ISA 402. That is when our client is using some service organization. That is our client is using any outsourcing services. For example, maybe our client has outsourced its tax compliance function. In that case, we'll be having this ISA in mind while drafting our procedures or maybe during our planning stage. But a disclaimer, make sure that you do not apply this ISA. I repeat, do not apply this ISA whenever we'll be talking about services of financial institutions, that are our banks and brokers. So, whenever we are talking about services of financial institutions, that part will not be included under ISA 402. Now, looking on to what this ISA contains. So, firstly, we'll be talking about documents, which will include the kinds of documents such as type 1 and type 2 report, which the auditor is expected to collect when the client is indulged with any outsourcing organization. Then we'll be talking about requirements that will be related to the planning stage or the different things that auditor will have to keep in mind while planning the audit of a client which is using any outsourcing function. And then finally, we'll be talking about the procedures or the steps that the auditor will have to draft and perform to obtain sufficient appropriate evidence regarding that service organization function as well. Under documents, we'll be having two kinds of reports. Firstly, a type 1 report and then type 2 report. Under both of these reports, we'll be having further two main materials, that is, firstly, a description and then a report prepared by a service organization. So, talking about report 1, it should contain a description prepared by the management of the service organization. That is, suppose this is our client and it is outsourcing a function to any company. Say this is the outsourcing company. So this description should be prepared by the management of this outsourcing company. And it should describe, firstly, its systems, control objectives and its related controls. And then finally, a report prepared by the service auditor conveying reasonable assurance on these materials. Then when we are talking about type 2 report, under this also we'll be requiring a description prepared by the management of the service organization regarding its systems, control objectives and related controls, and apart from that it will also include designs and implementation and operating effectiveness on a specified date. So this part is what is extra in our report 2 and is what will make our report 2 a much stronger evidence as compared to type 1 report. Then apart from that, again we'll be requiring a report from the service the service auditor conveying reasonable assurance on these materials. Moving on to requirements, this part is relevant for our planning stage, that is, what we are required to do regarding that service organization in our planning stage. We'll have to obtain understanding regarding the services provided by the service organization, and for that we'll have to include all these matters. Firstly, we'll have to understand the nature of the service provided. Then we'll understand regarding the materiality and the transactions processed. You can call this part as one of the most important ones. Then we'll be talking about the degree of the interaction between the client and the service provider. And again, we'll have to understand the relationship between the client and the service provider. Talking about procedures. Under procedures, we'll be obtaining type 1 or type 2 report, then contacting the service organization through the client or the user's entity, then maybe visiting the service organization and performing procedures. And if we are unable to do so, maybe we can hire another auditor to perform those procedures. Also, if there's any risk of material misstatements, in those circumstances we'll have to determine whether the sufficient appropriate evidence will be available from the records held by our client or the user entity, and then maybe perform further audit procedures or use any other auditor to perform those procedures. Finally, if there's any suspicion regarding the fraud or non compliance from the service organization, then in those cases, we'll have to obtain evidence regarding the nature, timing, and extent of the matters, and also perform further audit procedures to obtain evidence. And if the auditor is unable to do so in those situations, then finally the auditor will have to modify his report, because again we won't be having any sufficient appropriate evidence.